All right, so here's the situation. I'm pulled over by the side of the road in this classic car because I'm participating in Monterey Car Week. So there's a lot of classic car events happening this week and a lot of new car debuts as well. I am here with Mercedes and they've brought out a bunch of cars. They brought 2 pre-war cars that they're entering in the concours, and they brought out a gathering of classic cars for people like me to go and drive. And right now I am in what I think is my favorite one that they brought. This is a 1971 Mercedes 300 SEL 6.3. So basically this is the original S63 AMG. The backstory here is that they had a car called the 600, which was like a mega limousine for like dictators and politicians, royalty, crazy car. For that car, they made an engine called the M100, and it was a 6.3 liter single overhead cam, fuel injected engine, weighed 700 pounds, and its job was to move this giant limousine around with grace and ease. So it wasn't meant to be a racing engine, it was meant as a big torquey mill. However, they also made this car, which is the 300 SEL, and it is basically the modern equivalent of an S-Class. So it wasn't too long before the engineers figured out that the engine from the big limousine could be made to fit in this sedan, which is almost 1,000 pounds lighter than the big 600s. So they made what I consider to be the very first sports sedan. So enough talking, let's hit on the road, and I'll show you what this car is like to drive and tell you a little bit more about why this car is so special. Here we go. So, here's what makes this car so cool. Is that up front it is a 6.3 liter single overhead cam Bosch fuel injected V8. It makes 250 real horsepower, or if you count the way they used to rate horsepower in the 70s, 300. The point is that it makes a decent amount of power, but it also makes 350 pound-feet of torque, which means at any speed, you step on it, and there's just freight train of torque. It just pulls you along way faster than you need to go in this car. But it's not just the engine. Despite the fact that it's got this big honking engine, everything else in the car is like balanced and works with it. We have 4-wheel disc brakes, we have 4-wheel independent suspension, we have an incredible air conditioning system, wood dashboard, leather seats, stereo. This car has everything, and it should, because when it was new, it was so expensive. This car cost twice as much as a Cadillac, and it cost about in the same range as a Maserati at the time it was new. So this was a very expensive car. How fast could it go? Well, road test of the day said that 0 to 60 was good for about 6.5 seconds, and top speed was in the mid 130 mile per hour range. That made it one of the fastest sedans of the era, if not the fastest. But what impresses me about this car is how modern it drives. We only have 4 gears down here. It's a 4-speed automatic, but in terms of braking power, in terms of steering feel, in terms of just speed and comfort and stability, it really drives deceptively modern, even though you kind of have to work around the transmission. But this car is just so impressive to drive. You really could not believe that this car is, 50 years old. So this was a car with a list of celebrity owners almost as long as the Stutz Blackhawk we did. And the reason this car was so popular is that kind of the reason it's not as known today is that it doesn't outwardly look like a crazy car. You see an old Rolls Royce, you're like, wow, that looks really expensive. But it wasn't the same kind of thing. And honestly, I would say that this car is one of the very few that I've driven that feels like kind of like a modern car. I would say I drove a Citroën SM, which also felt way ahead of its time. This car also feels so advanced for the time period. But one thing that it has the SM did not is just all that power. There's power everywhere. The little tachometer in front of me is redlined at about 5,500 RPM, but there's no need to spin this engine that high. It drives like an old big block. It just doesn't care. Any revs, it'll pull like a train. And it doesn't have that like hot rod acceleration, like when you stomp on it from a light, it doesn't light up the tires or anything. It's not that kind of speed. This car has really, really long rear gears. I think they're like 260, 280 to 1 rear ratio. So it really is about relaxed highway cruising. And in fact, this road is actually like too small for it. This car wants to do 80 to 100 miles per hour all day. and it handles just fine on these twisty roads because it has four-wheel air suspension. That's right, it's always pumping up the suspension to make sure that the lean is countered, that if you fill it up with people and luggage, it's not going to sag. The air suspension is always working to make it drive as good as it can. And look how flat this giant car stays on these turns. Even though it's smaller than the 600, this is still a 4,000 pound car we're talking about from 1971, and we're just slicing through the corners with it. Like, there's really nothing quite like it that I've driven. Look at that. And you can see why this car actually had a pretty successful racing career. They did race this car at Spa, where I believe it won its class in the famous Red Sow race trim. They did eventually bore these out to like 6.8 liters. But as a driving experience, it's so great. It is so great. I've driven lots of American cars that have bigger engines and more power, and they're larger, and they have more acceleration. Truth be told, this is fast for a European car of the time, but compared to American hot rods and muscle cars, it doesn't have that kind of thrust. But the difference is that everything else in this car, the brakes, the steering, the suspension, is equally as good. Whereas those American muscle cars, I do love them, but they're just violence. Like, there's nothing really to control all that power. Other notes, this is a full-size car. There's a very comfortable back seat for two back there, and I have all the stretch-out room in the world. I have things like electric windows. I have not automatic climate control, but I do have AM/FM radio, and the quality of the interior in here is just amazing. So you saw that shift there. That's kind of the thing is, this transmission is the only part of the car that doesn't feel incredibly modern. It's good. It's good for the time period, but it's only got 4 gears, and you can't really choose your ratio with much grace. You're kind of in it or you're not. It is a 4-speed automatic versus the 3 speeds that were more common in this era. That's pretty cool. But man, what a car. I just wish that I was driving this car from like LA to Vegas. Like, this is a car for intercontinental cruising. And it'll do these twisty roads just fine, but what an experience. And I think it's cool that, this was an original hot rod, but it was more developed than you would expect. Now, because of the price tag, because of the rarefied air this car lived in, they only sold 6,500 of these ever. 6,500 worldwide. And I'm not sure how many are left, but I would say it's probably not more than half of them. It was a rare car when new, and I think it's even more rare today. I think that usually when you drive a Mercedes of this period, you're struck by the quality and how well things are put together, and this is no different. The high quality chrome and wood throughout the car is really impressive. The difference is here is that when you drive like a Pagoda or something, it's really nice, but it doesn't have any power. This thing has power for days. In fact, I think this was probably like one of the fastest Mercedes that they sold for quite a while. And this car is actually in such amazing shape because it is maintained by Mercedes-Benz Classic Center in Long Beach, California. They keep this car running. They let people like us drive it. And that way people can kind of experience the history of the brand and experience these historic touch points that Mercedes has been making for years. And check them out on Instagram. They have a very drool-worthy Instagram page. Look at that view. Well, that's a quick take on what it's like to drive a Mercedes 300 SEL 6.3, the beginning of the Mercedes super sedan. For Driving.ca, I'm Clayton Seams, and for more classic car coverage and events, don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Twitter.